than a lot of people are.
Thank you, Betty.
It's
So,
it's in your heart.
yeah, being Indian is a state of spirit. It's a state
Right.
of who you are being. It's
Right.
not any amount of blood quantum or numbers on a paper. But we're back here with Betty Jack. And as you know, we talked the first time with Betty about some of her family history and her parents, her grandparents. And again, that's the history of Oswaganing, of Lac du Flambeau. And we're back here today with Betty to talk a little bit more about her family history. But also, there's an interesting aspect to Betty's family history in that she has helped write and research and basically effectuate the ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act, which was put in place to help keep Indian families together, to help keep Indian children from being taken, being stolen by government agencies, by churches, religious organizations. And so, Betty, I know we talked informally before we came on camera, and you started talking about how you were reunited with your own children because of this, and your passion behind being Indian, and it's like we just said, it's a state of being. And to me, being Indian is about having family and being supportive of one another. And that's how the U.S. government destroyed American Indian families, and that was by tearing our families apart. As we know, the boarding school era, they stole our children, and then into the mid 20th century, they started, after the boarding school era, they used social service programs to steal our children and put them out for adoption. So this happened to you, is that correct, Betty?
Yes, it is. The one of the church organizations in Chicago took two of my children, and it wasn't until later on that I found out they had taken them across the state line and adopted my two children that they took away from me. The Evangelical Child Welfare Society was the Christian organization that was involved in taking them across the state line and adopted them. Oh, I never saw them again. I was never allowed to even.
So they came in and took your children from your home, from your care, and you had no knowledge where they went. They didn't tell you any information about them. They just took them from you.
They never told me, no court hearings, no nothing. At that time, they didn't have to notify anybody of court hearings. And when I tried to find out who these people were, I couldn't even find out who they were that took them. But they took my two children. They were from the churches, and they went to court. And then it wasn't until way later that I found out they had taken them across the state line and they were legally adopted out to a family on the Stockbridge-Muncie reservation. So.
And you were living in Chicago at this time, correct? I was living
in Chicago, yes, and I was never able to see them ever again. And it wasn't until in the 80s that I got a call late at night from one of my children that was adopted, Michael. I don't know if you want me to go into that.
Absolutely. Okay. So Mike Murphy.
Mike, yeah.
The late Mike Murphy.
Yeah, his adopted name was Murphy, but he had been living in Denver, Colorado, and he saw a movie that night that called The Divided Trail that was made by a fellow from Denver, Jerry Aronson, and it was aired in Denver where Mike was living with his friend, and he saw the movie, and then when he was reading the end of the movie where they showed all the people that were in it, he saw the name Betty Jane Chosa Jack on there, and he called the radio station because he had recalled seeing some papers of when he was young of his real mother's name, which was me. So he remembered the name Betty Jane Chosa Jack as being his mother that he was taken from. So anyway, he called the radio station, and it wasn't until 11 o'clock that night he saw the movie around about 7 in Denver.
Mm-hmm.
And about 11 o'clock, that's when he called. They finally got a hold of me in Webster, Wisconsin, where I lived at the time. But the radio station helped, and so did Jerry Ernst, and I guess they contacted him, and they had gotten phone numbers here and there, and finally called the house in Webster at 11, and he said his name was Mike. But it was late, and then I was sleepy, so I was saying, you know, I didn't want to play games. I know a lot of Mikes. I said I got a brother named Mike, and uncles named Mike, and people I know named Mike. I said, so Mike who? And he said, did you have a son named Mike? And that's when I just kind of like froze. I said, yes. He said, well, this is Mike, your son.
That's incredible. So,
Yeah.
so to recap, so you were living in Chicago. This religious organization comes in, social service program through this church comes and takes your 2 children from you, doesn't tell you anything about them. 20 years later, your now adult son, who is now 24, you said previously, right? He was 24 when he saw these
Yeah.
credits. He was watching a movie in Denver where he lived with his girlfriend. He was watching this movie in the theater, correct?
Yeah, no, it was on television.
It was on
yeah.
television. And so then he sees the credits with your name in the credits. So then he calls a radio station. He goes through this big network of making phone calls. And later on that night, he calls you and says, I'm your son.
Yeah.
What is that? What did that feel like to you? I mean, I can't imagine.
Well, yeah, I don't know, I just froze. I didn't answer. Oh, and then my husband woke up. He said, who is it? And I said, I couldn't even talk. Finally, I said, it's Mike. Mike who? And then I said, let me talk and I'll tell you about it. But I was just absolutely astounded. You know, I didn't know what to say.
Mm-hmm.
But I was so grateful, I guess, that he called.
And
then we exchanged phone numbers and everything, and I said, this is a bit much. I said, I need to have time to think about
digest
this.
it, right,
digest
right.
everything. So he said, me too. He said, we will talk again. So I said, we had phone numbers and addresses, and then that's.
But they had told him that you had died, correct?
He said that, yeah, he said he asked somebody about his mother, and they said that whoever it was told him that I had passed away. So he never bothered to try to find out.
And so part of this, and so then you also had a daughter too, right? You had Mike and then
Sue Ann.
And eventually you were reunited with them in their adulthood.
Right.
And I can imagine that this was, I'm going to assume, part of the initiative, part of your desire, your fire to help write ICWA and protect Indian children and Indian families, correct?
Well, when I was living in Chicago, Brandon, in 1969, there was a big move, you know, to look at all the Indian children that were being taken, and then that's when I got involved, because I was really feeling bad, because during those years, that's when they took Mike. Mike was born in 1959, and his sister was born in 1962. So in 1969, when I heard about people in Chicago and all over the United States researching all these Indian kids that were being stolen, I got involved with a group nationwide.
Mm-hmm.
And it was at that time in 1973 that we all went to Washington for a week-long testimony on Indian child welfare hearings that were held, Senate hearings. There's a big book written on all the Senate hearings that the senators looked at in order to help write the Indian Child Welfare Act, which a lot of us had input into.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so anyway, it was passed in 1978, and the president signed it in 1978. But we were testified in 1973, so 5 years later, the Indian Child.
So even while you and your children were separated, you were fighting
Yes.
on the front lines for ICWA to
Right.
get these Indian kids
Right.
back, to prevent Indian families from being broken up. Because again, that's how the military and the church, the Catholic Church and other churches destroyed Indian families. They knew that if they broke these families up, that we were easily conquered then.
Right. Yeah, and I think that was part of all the assimilation of Indian people to put us into the mainstream of society and get rid of the reservations, and they knew that our families were strong.
Mm-hmm.
And you were witness to that this morning, Brandon, when we had
I was.
people coming in here talking about her children being adopted out by people that took her children away. So
Yeah.
yeah.
So for people that don't know what we're talking about, what Betty's referring to is that before our interview here, we were just sitting and visiting, and Betty fed me old Indian breakfast. I appreciate that. And her nieces came over, and they were very upset. And not to get into too personal of the information, but people are still coming to Betty to this day to help advocate for Indian families and to help keep Indian families together and to reunite Indian families and to prevent Indian families from being broken up. So people still come to Betty. She's still on the front lines.
I'm on
the
elder board
Yeah.
for the Indian Child Welfare Act for a program here for an active plan. One of the elder members.
Mm-hmm. I've always admired your courage and your resolve. Whenever there's been turmoil or strife or controversy in the community, Betty is always there to help advocate for our people. And so we've been through some pretty harrowing experiences together ourselves. And we were involved in the I don't know if I'll lose any credibility, but we were involved in the takeover back in 2007, and always fighting for the advancement of Indian people and for equal footing. It seems like whenever Indians want something or want to do something, we always have to fight for it. We're always fighting. My good friend Brian Jackson, one of the quotes he uses is, we're always compromising, we're always negotiating, and it shouldn't be like that.
Right.
You know, if we say something, that should be it. But we're always having to fight and scratch, and I think that just speaks to our resolve and our spirit as Indian people. And looking ahead now, so where do you see Indian people going into the future? How do you see things playing out for Indian families?
Well, I've been speaking out a lot about the Indian housing, the issues that I've been trying to provide, like education to different families, because I think that a lot of the problems in Indian country come from the housing issues that are imposed, for our people to live on the reservations, and to break up more of our families by imposing all these housing rules on our families to live in
such a great woman and a great resource for our entire community. I was out there fighting on the front lines, fighting for Indian people, fighting for our families, so I wanted to say miigwech.
What we're talking about, best teacher ever.
That's right, best teacher ever. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I just thank you for doing what you do, miigwech.
And I just want to tell you, Brandon, one of the ways that we talk, and I learned this from my elders, and I heard this often, was thank you, Brandon, for being alive for me today. Thank you for being here, and we're like one person sharing, and it's not not goodbye. It's just thank you for being alive for me today. We're like one together. That's the way our people live, and that's our culture, and people need to remember that. So miigwech, miigwech.
Miigwech, Betty. Thank you.